Εντάξει, πού είναι ο καφές?
Δόξαν και Σπάρτιν, εμπρός, οχυρός στο πέρασμα! Για τη Σπάρτη, κρατήστε τη γραμμή, σταθμίστε θυμάμεν το ένα μας!
Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is John McKay. I am the Cranky Old Historian, and thank you for coming back again. Thank you for sticking with me while I sit here in my elderly retirement hood and pontificate. Today I want to get back to what I really had wanted to talk about since the very beginning of all of this, and that is history, the subject of history, and what is history. And I'm going to do a couple of episodes about specifically history and what it is and how you do it and what it's meant for, and just sort of ruminate. I don't really have much in the way of notes for this particular episode or the next one, sort of winging it in a way. But what I wanted to talk about today is reading history. And as a properly academically trained historian at the prestigious North Georgia College, which is called something wildly different today, the proper term is historiography. Historiography is the study of historical writings. And when you read a history book, that's literally what you were doing. And when you were in school, they probably taught you, okay, well, history, it has three components: primary, secondary, and tertiary, which is true. And most people know this. Primary sources are, if I was at a event and I wrote down a recounting of that event, that would be a primary source. This is someone who witnessed something and is telling you the story. Or a lot of oral histories are primary histories. This is someone talking to you. Oh, wow, I saw this, and this is what happened. For one example, my great-grandfather, Henry Taylor McKay, was a private in the Company H of 26th Alabama Infantry during the Civil War. He was wounded quite badly at a battle called South Mountain in Maryland. And he was still alive when my dad was young. So he used to tell the stories of all the battles he was in and all the stuff that he did and all the adventures and all that to my father. Now, my father had a primary source to his grandfather. Now, secondary sources are someone has written down something in a book and said, okay, here's what happened, and you're reading it. Okay? Or my father turning around and saying, well, my grandfather told me. That's a secondary source. And then you have tertiary sources, which mostly interest academic historians. I'll get to that in a second. And academic historians will go, okay, well, so-and-so wrote this book, and so-and-so said this about that book. So this was his analysis. And I have McKay's own sort of carved up things of history, and you're probably not going to find these. I think every historian has their own pet ways of dividing up history, and these are mine. First off, you have chronology. Names and dates and battles and generals. And this is quite frank. It's just the facts. What happened? A happened to B, happened to C. In journalism, which is a kind of a subset of chronology, you have who, what, when, where, why, and occasionally how. And the why is sometimes left out too. Chronology is why history is so boring when you're in school. It is just like watching grass grow. And I used to have a website called History Addict, and the motto of that website is what you slept through in high school. And this is why I had that on there. I was a teacher. I was bored by half of this stuff. And I've mentioned this before. Era of good feelings. Or as I like to say today, we're in the era of bad feelings. And there's nothing boring about it. So chronology is just the facts. Now this is essential. Like, I do a Bible study every morning, and right now I'm in Leviticus, and Leviticus is the Jewish laws. This is the 24th time I've been through the Bible from A to Z. 24 years ago, I think it was, I started every year I read the Bible cover to cover from January 1st to December 31st. And I have a couple of different plans I use. And honestly, Leviticus, it has no relevance to today outside of references to it. And it's like watching grass grow. And I was talking to a friend of mine, and they were saying, pray for me, I'm suffering through Leviticus. I said, well, I am too. It doesn't really have any meaning to us, but it's important because it lays a foundation. And that's what chronology does, is it lays down a foundation. This is the facts of the matter. This is what happened. Okay? So think about chronology as being high school history. Names, date, battles, and generals, that kind of stuff. Okay, next up you have what I call anecdotal history. This is the stories. And one of the highest praises I ever got as a teacher was that I had students who actually told me years later, they're adults now, they said, I really enjoyed your class, or I had one tell me just the other day, I wish I could go back to that. I didn't realize how good it was at the time. And, you know, that's life. You never know how good you have it at that particular moment. And the reason why, I asked one on why. I said, why? Just, history's kind of boring when you teach it there. Oh, it's all the stories you told. Well, a lot of my stories had little, if anything, to do with the subject at hand. I was real big on life lessons, and I worried about these kids a lot. And I would tell them, I say, if you're good today, I will tell you a paramedic story. And we'll be good. And I always tried to make them something funny, the funny stories. I wouldn't ever tell them the bad ones. I've got stories I've never told my own wife that I don't even want to think about. And every paramedic's like that. But, and it's funny how many of my kids came back later and said, man, I still have nightmares to this day about these stories. I'm like, what? Those were the funny ones. What are you talking about? But you can tell stories about the figures in history. When we talked about Light Horse Harry Lee, I would always mention, he was kind of a ladies' man, and that's why he got captured, is he was messing around with a British officer's wife. And that's the kind of stuff, and like my wife says this all the time, it's like, this is what's interesting about history, and it is. It's the stories, and it's how you can connect to people. As a historian, the thing I got really most interested in, and it had to do with the studies I was doing early on in my career, mostly on American Civil War studies, is how did these guys come home? This grandfather I mentioned, this great-grandfather I mentioned, H.T. McKay, he came home missing a leg and had to walk from Atlanta to Alabama. And that he got there and it was just in wreckage because a Yankee cavalry raid had come through not long before and pretty much destroyed everything. And I got interested. I said, how do you come home from that? And then you talk to these World War II guys and even more so the Vietnam War guys and to kind of in between the Korean War guys. Vietnam War guys, I've had quite a few I've talked to that said, one day I'm in the jungle doing patrol getting shot at, and literally 48 hours later I'm in Chicago at home. And how do you adjust to this? How do you just come back? When I got out of the service and I saw nothing, I was in, Cold War. I was a Cold Warrior. Nothing happened combat wise while I was in. And I came home and I set my bags down the driveway after I got out of the cab. And I thought, what the hell do I do now? And I can only imagine what those guys thought. And so this has been of great interest. This is the stories. How do people come back from deeply traumatic events? And why does it tend to stick to some people or seem to stick to some people? Why doesn't it? These are the stories. Okay, so that's anecdotes. You have chronology and it's subset of journalism, and I'll rant some more about that later. And you have anecdotal, the stories. And then you have analytic histories. Analytic histories are where the book is trying to say, okay, this is what happened, and it might have some stories, and here's some interesting stories to keep your attention. But what does this mean? these are the guys you see on BBC a lot. These pompous historians. What exactly did this mean? And, okay, whatever. And these, to me, are interesting, sort of, sometimes. But they can get overly, what I call academic, real easy. Academic history. If you take history in college as a major, you turn into an academic historian, and you can tell if it's an academic study by if the footnotes, endnotes, and or the references are longer than the actual narrative itself. You've got an analytic history, and there's problems with that. I'll tell you a little story about something I came up with because I kept noticing something. And early on, I was doing research on something. I don't remember what it was. And I kept saying, my God, these people have these massive references, mostly of secondary sources. And it's like, okay, huge list of them. And where are they finding all this stuff? And what is all this stuff? And so I looked and I'm trying to figure it out. And finally, I noticed something. It dawned on me. I said, this is, and I adopted the term, what was the term I came up with? Circular reference or circle references. And I won't say there was a punk rock band that had a name similar to that. And I was thinking about the other day, and then I thought, man, this fits. Circle references. And what this means is, okay, I have written something. Okay. I've written something. Someone else goes down here and they write about what I have written. Okay. And then you get someone else along who writes about what someone else has written about what I have written. And then the fourth part, I refer to that tertiary source as one of my references when it's really just talking about what I said to begin with. I just think that's funny. Doesn't really mean anything. But it's, if you're going to write a long referral list, you end up with a lot of circle references. And I just thought it was funny. Serious histories, you tend not to really like those too much until you turn 50. If you're a guide, you turn 50. It's like, I saw somebody else the other day that when you turn 50, you have a choice between getting really serious about smoked meats or really serious about World War II history. And it's funny, but there's a lot of truth to that. And I've been interested in history since I was a kid and listened to my dad talk about his granddad and, the Civil War history and all that. And then my own dad's history of World War II and things like that, various cousins and all that who were in Vietnam and Korea and stuff like that. And so this is what interested me. And finally, you get down to my rant about journalism. Journalists really like to think of themselves as historians. Some of them do, not everybody. But they're not. Journalists have a job, and their job is very, very important. And way too many I'm paid too little attention to it. Their job is to collect names and dates and battles and generals as accurately as possible. Because then historians like me will come along, and one of the first things I do when I was going to research something new, I'll tell you the truth, I'll look on Wikipedia. Now, Wikipedia is horrible, and I would never let someone use it as a reference, but it's a good starting point. And I always said that. Okay, use it to start. You don't rely upon that. Because anybody can change it. That's the whole point of that place, is that anybody can make an edit to it. And you have a lot of trouble with that, especially when it comes to politics. But that'll start you on a journey. And if you can get started, you can continue. And that's when you start going down the chain of references. And the thing I always look at in the Wikipedia pages is, where are the references? Let me go look at back at what. And it's honestly amazing how many times that the reference they have listed there has absolutely zip to do with what they were talking about. In the end, it undermines them. And, that's one of the problems with Wikipedia. They make you put down references. Where did you find this? And, well, I found it here. Okay. And they don't always check it, especially if it's some niche article or something like that. So this is what journalists are supposed to do. Now, a lot of journalists end up writing books. Okay. I'm going to write a book. There was a famous one, All the King's Men. that was talking about Nixon, and Woodward and Bernstein wrote it. They were at the Washington Post, and of course they're the famous ones involved in the Watergate scandal. And I will tell you one thing, and this is why journalists are not historians. At the time, that book was a sensation, and everybody read it. And if it's in print, you take it as true because they wouldn't let you print it if it wasn't true. Well, same goes for the internet, right? You can't put it on the internet if it's not true. There is an axiom in history, serious history, that at least 50 years have to pass before you can properly evaluate any event. Well, Watergate's past that point now, and we're looking at it again. Some people are looking at it again, and they're getting a completely different idea about it. And they're really looking at Nixon. And Nixon, you hear about Trump delusional syndrome and all the people who have problems with Trump today. It's nothing compared to the trouble that the same sorts of people had with Nixon back in the day. And to this day still have trouble with Nixon. And Nixon was seen as the worst demon ever. Even more so than Trump, if you can believe that. And now things are coming out where it turns out that was a lot more complex of a situation. And putting it in the context with what was going on, at the time we were in the middle of a Cold War, and we were in the middle of a serious Cold War with Russia and China. And we didn't know really what their capabilities were, and everybody was kind of afraid of them for good reason. And you have to put that into that context. Well, that world sort of went away, and it's been so long it's kind of come back again in terms of Russia. We're back in another Cold War with them again. But you have the ability here to look at records and then look at them in context and then say, okay, what about this? What about that? Getting back to journalism. On top of journalism, just straight out chronology, record keeping is so important. One of the reasons we know so much about the Nazis, the actual Nazis, not the thing the left keeps talking about Trump being, the actual National Socialists, is they were meticulous record keepers. And even though a lot of records were destroyed at the end, either through Allied bombing or through their own destruction or just simple loss, a lot of records survived. A stunning amount survived. So we know a lot. There was a book I read back when I was in high school. It's called Soldier by a man named Anthony Herbert. And he was the most decorated enlisted man in Korea from America. And he later became an officer, and he had some political problems in Vietnam, and long story, but he wrote a book called Soldier, and a lot of the book is him talking about his political problems he had with other officers over there. But one thing that struck me that he said in there has always stuck with me was he was talking about, he was the Inspector General of the 173rd Airborne, and he was talking to some commander, and he said, I hear that they were talking about a battle they were in, and the guy was claiming, yeah, we had 50 North Vietnamese casualties. Well, how many bodies did you get? Well, we only got 2. Well, how'd you figure 50 then? Well, we figure that we think they had like 96 people there in front of us, and so 48 dragging off the other 48, and then you got two left over, or something like that. It was something like that. In other words, it was a completely made-up number. We had so many blood trails off into the jungle, and we can't find the bodies, and this, that, and the other, and okay. So, but you've got 2 bodies on the battlefield, so you got, why didn't you say you had 2 killed and unknown number wounded? Well, that doesn't look as good. And in there, he said something very, very interesting. He said, here's the problem. In the future, historians are going to look back at the combat record of the 173rd in Vietnam, and we do this today, and say, wow, they killed 50 NVA that day. Well, journalists had already figured this out towards the end of the U.S. combat phase of the Vietnam War in 1973, and had figured out that at one point, if you took all of our records at face value, that we had killed the entire population, man, woman, and child of North Vietnam 2.5 times over. So if you don't get the basic records correct, this is what's so critical about chronology, then you end up with nonsense like this. It's going to be very difficult from now on to properly evaluate the Vietnam War from our perspective, because we don't really have, how effective were we? We don't really know. We don't really know. We can talk to the Vietnamese. We're very friendly with them now, so we can talk to them. So that helps. But when you go further and further and further forward in history, you're not going to have the ability to talk to people who were there and who had firsthand knowledge. So it's going to be difficult. So when you have journalists who have decided that they're historians, and worse than that, they're analytic historians. Journalists, by and large, are not trained to do this. This is why you end up with what I call Insta-books. You have a book written, he's a New York Times reporter, Washington Post reporter, and he wrote this important book about something that happened politically last year. Well, that's nonsense. You can't do that. You can say, well, there's already books out about Trump's second administration, which he just started last year. This is ridiculous. It's going to be, 2100 before we ever can really properly evaluate, the Trump presidencies, and see it in context with how effective were they? What did they do? What you do is you have political operatives pretending to be journalists and pretending to be historians, and this is really, really bad. And then you have other problems. You have people are people, and people sometimes get bored, or people sometimes are out of their league or whatever. There was a historian who's now been very, 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 his reputation is very tarnished. S.L.A. Marshall, S.L.A. Marshall. And he wrote a influential book after World War II, and I don't remember the name of it. But in there, he claimed that something like only 1 out of every 20, I think is what he said, 1 out of every 20 infantrymen ever actually fired their weapons. What? Okay. Well, this is interesting. And so this book was highly influential in the way military training progressed. Even when I was in the 1970s, I remember some number like that being banded around. It's been determined that. And what it was is S.L.A. Marshall was a U.S. Army officer, and he was charged with doing this kind of research and figuring out, how effective was our infantry, so we can turn around for the next war, because there's always going to be one, and be most effective. Well, it turns out later that he had simply made up a lot of his research, just wrote it down. Made it up. Why? I have no idea. I don't really care. All I know is he made it up. So this is completely and utterly useless. If you have someone writing about an event that happened last year, if they are writing about, okay, this happened on this date, this time, and these people were involved, great. That's all I need to know. Well, this is what this means. I don't care. You don't have any context to put it in. You don't have any context to put it in. So that's my rant about journalism. And I will mention also there's genealogy, which is also a subset of chronology. Genealogy is something that a lot of people get into when they get to my age or sometimes younger. And you go to a site like Ancestry.com or something like that, and you can start looking up your family, and I like Ancestry. It's really cool. And then that's when you can start putting down the pictures and the stories, the newspaper articles and birth and death record. Wonderful resource. Great resource. Not a whole lot of self-check features, and you end up with a lot of chaff with the wheat. Let's just put it that way. So you kind of got to be careful how you plow through that particular field. But it's very interesting. And this is also a part of history. Now let's talk about what history is. When you write about history, there's basically 5 kinds of history. There's cultural history, political history, social history, economic history, and military history. A lot of people do not include military history, but I think I do. I think it's a very interesting discipline all by itself. So when you're looking at a history, what kind of history are you looking at? There are people who write cultural histories of, say, the Civil War, and they're fascinating. It's like, what did people eat, and how, and what did they wear, and where did they get all their stuff? There's some great histories about the Old West that are out that talk about life on the Great Plains. And Laura Ingalls Wilder, who wrote Little House on the Prairie, some serious histories about her time out there, and it's not pretty at all. And very, very interesting. And some new stuff. My wife is particularly interested in these. The women who were captured by Native American tribes and sort of forcibly absorbed into the tribe for a period of a few years. There's several books out that are looking, they're secondary sources. They're looking at the original diaries and letters and even memoirs that these women wrote later in life, 150 so years ago when they came out, and they're looking at it in context. Well, how did this work out, and what did this do, and is this how does this change our view of the Native Americans? And right now, I mean, when I was growing up, you started to have a sea change. In my parents' and grandparents' days, Indians were seen as savages. And my mother knew people who in their lives had known Native Americans in Alabama late into the Native American period there. And we're talking about, what kind of people they were, and they weren't super impressed with them. And after that came the noble savage thing. And, these were nobles, and we're still saddled with this idea today. Natives were these somehow spiritual people who walked in peace with the earth and all that crap. And natives were people like everybody else on earth. Some of them were peaceable. Some of them were just jerks. Some of them were warlike. Some of them were not. Some of them were nomadic. Some of them tended to be fixed in place. Not every Native American lived in a teepee, for example. Not everyone used eagle feathers for whatever reason. There was a plethora of languages used. And then you have some interesting things, and there's some new books that have come out, and they're talking about this. For example, the Comanche were on a rampage through the American Southwest. Comanche were a very warlike, very vicious nation, and to the other Native American nations, and they were on a rampage, basically defeating every other Native American nation they ran up into, and then they ran into the U.S. Army and ended up being defeated by them. And I saw where a historian was talking about in one of his books that if we had not come along, the Comanche probably would have been the predominant Native American nation on the North American continent within just a few years, because they were truly on a rampage to do that and had the ability to do it, even though they were running into other warlike nations like the Apache. The Apache were pretty much defending their own homes. And so they were vicious fighters there, but they weren't like the Comanche where they were going out to expand their territory. So you have the cultural histories. This is what they tend to talk about, is how did this culture live? A lot of sociology in this. How do these people get along with each other? What are the languages they spoke? And these quite interesting books. Political histories, of course, this is just politics. From day one, we've had those. I used to make my kids suffer by reading a book called Democracy in America by de Tocqueville, who was a French diplomat in the early American experience. And he had some real interesting to say. He had a very dry sense of humor. And as one student of mine said, he repeats himself all the time. I said, well, yeah, so does the Bible. It's, if he's got a point to make, he's trying to make that point over and over. And he pretty much dead on accurately predicted what we have today. So, we have some interesting things there. So you've got political histories. Then you have economic histories. And how did this particular, not only how this business worked, but how did this nation work as a economic powerhouse? And what were the great nations? Why did these great nations fail? And why does capitalism work? Does communism work? When you read the Communist Manifesto, you're pretty much reading economic history. It's political and economic. I would tend to say that having read it leans way heavily more towards the economic history. It's talking about the history of money, the history of money as power, and how that power is used. And then, of course, you have culture history. Social history and cultural history are very similar. Social history tends to devolve down into biographies, how individual people were and how they related to everybody around them. You have some social histories of peoples, but they tend to cross ways with cultural history a lot. And then you have military history. And this is the kind that guys my age really, really get into. What happened when? It's fascinating. Like I've mentioned before, I live just minutes from several different Civil War battlefields. And what I find interesting is to walk the very ground that this walked on, that this happened on, and think about things that happened there at that time. I used to go out every May 27th, for example, and go to Cheatham's Hill at Kennesaw Mountain and walk over to the Dead Angle. And I'd sit there and I'd read a memoir written by a Civil War soldier named Sam Watkins. And he wrote a book called Company H. And he described what happened at the Dead Angle there. He was right there. And I could sit literally next to where he was standing and just consider what he wrote and just try to imagine, 150 years ago, what this looked like, 150 whatever years ago. What did this look like? How did this play out? Just interesting stuff. And again, like I mentioned earlier, how do these people come back? And then you have the history of weaponry and, tanks and artillery pieces and guns and this and that and the other. And then a lot of this is about the what I call the swells, the important people, as much of history. About the generals, what were they like? And what did they say and what did they do? And we've had a lot of very colorful generals in our history. So that's the different kinds of history that you run into. To keep this from going way too long, I was going to dive down a little bit more into history itself, and I'll probably do that later. But I want to talk today about a historic event and how three different sources covered it. And maybe you'll get a little more understanding about how history works, how history is done. And that is a battle in the first Persian invasion of the Greek city-states in 483 BC, if I remember correctly. And you had a large Persian force moving south towards Athens and Sparta and a lot of the other smaller city-states. And what were we going to do? Well, the Olympics were going on at that time, and they were going to do this instead of fighting. And there was a Spartan king named Leonidas who recognized the danger. And what he needed to do was slow down the Persian invasion long enough for all the celebrations. The Olympics were way more of a religious observation than they are today, at least overtly religious observation than they are today. And there were certain ceremonies that had to be done. And it was illegal to fight. It was illegal to go out to war. And obviously the Persians weren't going to obey that. But Leonidas said, okay, well, I got to slow down things. So he recognized that there was a natural choke point. There's a narrow pass called the Hot Gates, Thermopylae, the Hot Gates. And if he could get a force right there at that gate, where you can only put, I think only about a company or so of men, and 100 men or so at a time could pass through that gate. So narrow pass on its way to Athens and Laodicea, Sparta. Then he could hold them up. But he was forbidden to do so because of all the ceremonies. So instead, he took his personal guard of 300 men. And he was met there by about 6,000 other Greeks. It was not just the 300. For the first couple of days of the battle, there was about 6,000 more Athenians and Thebians and a few others were all there. What happened was they managed to hold up. Xerxes the First was the one the king over this particular Persian Empire at the time, and he ordered his forces forward, and they fought to a standstill for 2 days. And then a local resident, probably bribed. The real story, you hear a lot of different real stories. Stories about why this happened. We know the man's name. And Pet, I'll get Pet to put his name here. I don't recall it off the top of my head. But he showed the Persian military leaders a path through the mountains to get behind where Leonidas and his force was, so they could bypass him and cut him off and hit him from both sides, take him out. Because when you have a pass like that, I don't care. The Persian force, depending on the sources you read, and most of the primary source we get from this is from a Greek historian named Herodotus, and he wrote in the Histories. He wrote, I do believe, and I'd have to go back and look at this again, that he wrote that the Persians had over 1 million men. And you hear sources like that. Modern historians think that he had somewhere between 60 and 100,000 men. That's still a lot. And again, you've got about 6,000 total Greeks, give or take a few hundred in that pass. Well, it doesn't matter. It sounds like, they could just walk right over you. Not if you're in a narrow spot like this, in a choke point like that, a narrow choke point like this. You cannot pass. So Leonidas was brilliant at choosing his defensive ground. And saying, I can hold here for a long time, not forever, but for a long time, and buy time with our lives. And they knew it was a suicide mission. All of them did. But to a Spartan warrior, there's nothing better than to die in battle. My Lord. And you see this kind of echoing all throughout military history and all these different cultures, not just the Spartans. The best thing you can possibly do is die in battle. Even today, you look around X and Facebook and you run all these memes. 10 out of 10 bleed out spot. This is what this means. Die in battle, defending your family is the highest honor a man can have, and it's built in you. You're not built to die in a bed surrounded by your loved ones. You're built to die in a hopeless fight surrounded by empty brass. It's the way of the world. It's the way men are made by God. We're warriors. We're defenders of our family and of our country. Well, Leonidas could hold out, but once he got bypassed, he recognized what was going to happen. He ordered everybody else to leave. Some Athenians stayed, some Thebians stayed. He probably had a couple of thousand people there with him at the end, and they were eventually defeated. Traditionally, it's held that the Thebians surrendered. That's kind of up in the air. Only one contemporary historian kind of mentions them and talks about them. There's also a mention of a special operation style raid on Xerxes' own camp by some of the Spartans. And again, only one historian wrote about that. So it may have happened. It may not have happened. We don't know for sure. We very little. We don't have very much information, but we do know all that happened. And what happened was it did slow. It worked. Leonidas died along with all but 2 Spartans that had been sent back for a couple of different reasons. And in there, through his life and the lives of his warriors, he was able to slow down the Persians long enough to let the Athenians and the rest of the Spartan armies come up and They were later defeated in the next battle. The Persians were defeated in the next battle, and the naval battle that was going on at the same time, naval and land combat were going on at the same time. Kind of the first really serious combined arms invasion force, you might say, that's at least written down. Outside of Troy, but we could talk about that later. But I wanted to talk about 3 historical works that talk about this. And the first one I've already mentioned is you have Herodotus, who was a Greek historian, and he wrote a book called the Histories. And in there, it's a very good, if kind of dry and fairly short recitation. And the primary facts of what we know about this comes from the Histories, the vast majority of what we know about this battle. The things that Leonidas supposedly said. Now, I will say this about Herodotus. Herodotus is considered the father of history, and I call him the father of gossip. He wrote down everything, and this is where the Amazonian warrior, women who cut off one breast so they could fire their arrows easier, fire their bows easier. This is where this story came from. It's one of his other histories, and one of his other book of histories. Is he went, oh, really, and just wrote it down. No analysis, no sources, please. What's your source on that? Like you see so much online these days. He just wrote down everything. It was another Greek historian named Thucydides that actually went back and said, okay, well, let me look at this, and let me look at some other sources and all that. Now, I consider Thucydides much more important historian than Herodotus. Now, Herodotus is the first written down contemporary histories that we have. And I've talked about the timelines of history, and I'll talk more about them later. My next episode, I'm going to be talking about writing history, and I'll talk more about how history evolved into written history. But we do have older histories than this, but these are contemporary history. These are things going on at the time, and or at least shortly thereafter, like we have today. So you have Herodotus, the Histories, which, great book, you need to read it. Incidentally, let me make this as an aside. I'm an Amazon associate. I have links down below in the description for anything I mention on here, or a lot of things I mention on here. And if you click on that and buy whatever through there, I get like a nickel or dime. It's not going to charge you any more for it, and I just appreciate it. It helps me in keeping coffee. That's all. All right, back to this. The second book I want to talk about just real briefly is another translation of Herodotus. There's 2 good ones. The first one is called The Landmark Herodotus by a man named Robert Strassler. Really excellent all the way. Very readable. If you've never read ancient history works before, this is the one to go to. There is another historian named Robin Waterfield, and she translated another edition of Herodotus Histories. And what's interesting is I like Robin's work. Her work is very good. It's very good. A little more academic, a little more stilted. It's interesting to read both of them and see the differences, because translating from one language to another is difficult at best, especially when it's poetic in nature. And we'll talk more about that the next time. So there's 2. There's actually 4 works I'm talking about today. Third book I want to talk about is a 1998 novel by a man named Stephen Pressfield. And it's called Gates of Fire. And it is a novel, a novelization of Herodotus' history of what happened at Thermopylae. And you're like, this is a novel. Why are you as a historian recommending this? I love this book. This is actually one of my favorite novels. Because what it does is, Pressfield is brilliant. He writes a number of these novels like this. He takes the history and he plugs it in, and it's very good history. And then he brings it to life. The way he writes about the Spartans, they're more like contemporary Marines. They're foul-mouthed, filthy, have Marine style of humor. the way they do everything, there's F-bombs throughout the entire book. Obviously, in ancient Greek, they didn't know the F word, but that kind of thing. And you could hear them saying this. And he described, and the book is set as I want to say it's a Theban. I don't remember. It was a slave that had been captured or was working with the Spartans and was up there basically as an armor bearer for one of the Spartans' warriors. And he was captured during the battle. He was wounded and captured, and he was brought before Xerxes, and he was asked, what is it about this? Now, this has got some contemporary fact to it. Supposedly, some of these Thebans that were captured were brought before Xerxes, and they were asked, why are you fighting me with a couple of thousand guys? Is this all you have in your army? Oh, no. We have the Olympic Games going. You have to understand, we have to do that first. And Xerxes supposedly asked, well, what do they win in the Olympic Games? They win an olive branch laurel. That's it? Yes. And the honor of winning. So these men who are competing for honor are considering that more important than fighting an invasion force. Well, yeah. And you can imagine how that rocked him back on his heels if that happened. That may or may not have happened. But it has the ring of truth to it. I could see him hearing about this and being shocked at it. But in the book Gates of Fire, this captured slave is describing how the Spartan warriors lived to Xerxes and how they existed, and how you basically describing to him, you're not going to defeat these people. It's just not going to happen. You may kill them all, but you'll never defeat them. And it's just a fascinating work. And then closely associated with that is the fourth work I want to talk about, and that is a graphic novel, a comic book by Frank Miller called 300. And he takes the story from Herodotus and turns it into a very visual spectacle. And it's very interesting, especially if you're into graphic novels. And it's fairly faithful-ish to Herodotus' history. But then in 2006, a director named Zack Snyder took Frank Miller's novel and made it into a movie by the same name called 300, or sometimes The 300. Which is really interesting, is you've got a movie based on a graphic novel and using the same kind of visual elements that's based on a contemporary serious history that is 2,500 years old. And in that movie, I love that movie too. I honestly do. It shows the spirit of the Spartans.
This is where we hold them! This is where we fight! This is where they die! And these shields, boys! Remember this day, man, for it will be yours for all time.
Is it accurate? No. The Spartans did not wear leather underwear and nothing but that and a cloak into battle. It talks a lot about how big and buff and strong they are, and Herodotus talks a lot about that, and other historians of the day talk a lot about that. And the reason is this: they were actually wearing like 80 pounds of bronze armor. They had to be big and buff to even walk around with that stuff, much less use it in combat. And the way that they fought, as a unit, they had to be highly trained and oriented towards that. The Spartan society was a train wreck of a society when you look at it. I mean, every Spartan male was in the army up until the age of 60. I think it was 60. You when you were 10 years old, you were taken away and you started your training. And you were raised by your mother until then. All of a sudden one day, okay, you're off and you're into this brutal system. It's absolutely brutal to make you into a warrior. And then when you turned 20, I think it was, then you were released for a year or two to get married, have kids, and then you went right back to the barracks and you stayed there for most of the rest of your life fighting. Well, who did all the work? It was slaves. It was a slave economy. And slaves in the ancient world very different than the slavery like in the American experience. And we can talk more about that later. That's a big rabbit hole to get down to. But it was not a society that could really function, but it functioned well, very well, at doing what it did. It was a function built around military combat. It was a society built around that, built for that. And when it came to that one purpose, it did very well. Athens had a great army too, but they had a deep army. And when you consider, I can say one fact about Athens that kind of underscores everything. The great philosopher Socrates, who you've undoubtedly heard about, he was a soldier, a warrior in the Athenian army and had seen combat. And yet his greatest renown came as a philosopher. Well, the Spartans looked upon it completely differently. They would have renowned him for being a warrior and respected him for that. So that's just the way their society was set up. So this is how history works. So you have these different kinds of histories and these different studies of history, and the means and method of doing it are different. Oral history, a really good friend of mine, great person, gave me an oral history of D-Day that I've still got to dig into for Christmas last year. And these oral histories are wonderful, and they're great. And I find them fascinating because these people were there and this is what they saw. Well, it's what they're seeing and describing accurate to their event. Well, it is to their experience of it. And you have their overlay of their experiences. Then you have the chronologies, names and dates and battles and generals, and that's important. And then you have the anecdotal, the stories, the popular histories. I have written 5 books. Mine are popular histories. I'm writing because I'm not writing for other historians. I'm writing for people. And an interesting story to read. And in there, I had my first book I wrote was called Insider's Guide to Civil War Sites in the Southern States. And I had an Amazon review of it where the guy said, man, this guy's got a real serious Southern bias to him. Well, no kidding. I'm a Southern historian. Here's the thing. Every single historian has a bias. Everybody who writes or presents a history in any way has a bias of some sort. And this is why it's so important to know those biases. There was a great Civil War historian named Burke Davis who had a very serious Northern bias. Okay, well, you knew that about him. And his were accurate, but he always leaned, towards the Northern armies and stories about them and all that. I lean very heavily toward the Southern armies and things like that because of who I am. It's not that what I'm saying is inaccurate or anything like that. It's just this is the automatic bias because I'm human. And every historian is human. This is why it's so dangerous to have what's going on today and presented as history. Is you have people say, you're on the wrong side of history. Come over with us, you'll be on the right side of history. Number one, there's no wrong, there's no right side of history. There's just history. What happened? Number two, we don't know what side's going to be what side considered later. Today, Richard Nixon was considered an absolute villain for the last 50 years. Now, not so much. Joe McCarthy, who was an anti-communist crusader in the 1950s as a senator, was, when I was young, my dad talked trash about him all the time, hated his guts. I mean, everything about it. He was the most awful person ever. It turns out he was 100% accurate. He was absolutely right about what he was saying. And mistakes he made, or supposed mistakes he made, it turns out there were very, very good reasons for what he did. He refused to release a list, and he kept changing the numbers on there, and people made fun of him for that. Well, I've got 97 names, I have 54 names, I got 123. Well, it turns out that the list of names he was given that was supposed to be the number of communists in the State Department, well, it kept changing because his own people would say, no, we've cleared this guy. And that's why he would never release a list. He said, I would rather not release a list that might have a wrong name on it than release a name with 100 people who were guilty. And that's what happened. He had honor and integrity. It turns out Richard Nixon did too. So when you realize that these people had great honor and great integrity, and they weren't criminals, as they were accused of being at the time by the left, you start seeing things differently. So right side, wrong side of history, there really isn't such. There's just history. And it's important to know who's writing it and who's putting it out because of what bias it is. Me, I'm a cranky old historian with a Southern bias. I love my home state of Georgia. I love my home of Appalachia, or Appalachiastan as I call it a lot. I love everything there is about the South. I love my country dearly. And I think, it's one of the great countries. Does we have problems? Yes. But by and by, we've been a wonderful force for good in the world. That's my bias. And you have other people who've written others. Counter to me, there's a historian named Howard Zinn who wrote a book called The People's History of the United States. Very liberal historian. This book is very popular on college campuses. And I will tell you, here you can sum up Howard Zinn with one point. In his book, A People's History of the United States, he spends 1.5 pages talking about the entire American Civil War. He pays 16 pages of attention to the Reagan-era Iran-Contra scandal that was going on at the time he put the book out. That should tell you, and you've probably never even heard of that. And that should tell you, because his bias was extremely liberal, extremely left-wing. Now, is the book completely useless? No, he's got some good points in there. But I find it unreadable because he's writing from such a politically polarized point of view. He doesn't have a bias. He's got an axe to grind, and there's a difference. Me, I got an axe to grind too. I want more coffee. Okay, and we've been babbling long enough. We're almost an hour, and thank you for sticking with me. And we'll pick up next time here on the Cranky Old Historian. I hope to see you back here. Thank you very much.